We're here at the Presidio of San Francisco, and behind me is what used to be Letterman Army Medical Center and is now Industrial Light and Magic. I was stationed here when I was in the military in the early 90s, and the military base was decommissioned in about 1994 and then turned over to civilian use. When they turned it over to the civilians, they came in and demolished some of the buildings and modified some of the buildings, and that's how Industrial Light and Magic came to get this building behind me. In the distance is the Palace of Fine Arts, which is not far away. It's pretty amazing that they completely demolished the existing building and replaced it with something that looked more like a building that would be here on the Presidio. So the Army and San Francisco always had this very difficult relationship where the people in San Francisco hated war and they hated the Army being stationed in San Francisco. So when they took over the Presidio, they ended up tearing down a lot of the existing buildings and in some cases rebuilding them, and in some cases just leaving them to rot and to decompose. In the case of the Letterman Army Medical Center, they tore down the whole building. It was a modern building built, I believe, in the 1950s. They demolished that and gave it to Industrial Light and Magic and rebuilt it as a place to do special effects for movies. We're here at Crissy Field, which I now call Crissy Swamp. If you look behind me, they remade a wetland in the middle of Crissy Field. Historically, Crissy Field was an army base and was one of the most important airfields during World War II and before. Before it was an airfield, it was part of the Panama-Pacific Exposition and was the site of many of the buildings at the Panama-Pacific Exposition. Prior to that, it was grazing land for the Spanish Army when the Spanish occupied the Presidio. Before that, it was used for fishing for the Native Americans that lived here. So we have to go back to about 1860 before this land was actually wetlands. And at that time, prior to about the 1860s, much of San Francisco was wetland and eventually got filled in and turned into usable area for human habitation. So they turned multi-million-dollar real estate. This land would have been worth millions and millions of dollars if it was developed into some type of building. And they turned it into what I call fake nature or hyperreal nature. Developers took maps from the 1800s that showed the tidal marsh that was here and then recreated that tidal marsh based on inaccurate and incomplete maps from the time. So what you're seeing behind me is actually an overlay of an 1800s map overlaid over the existing environment. And in order to do that, they had to destroy the existing airfield that was here. The idea was to turn it back into its natural condition, but that natural condition wasn't a real condition. It was an idealized condition based on historic maps. So the purpose was to turn Crissy Field into an estuary for birds. Unfortunately, very few birds come here to use it. There's thousands of people that walk along the paths. There's thousands of cars that drive by on the road. You can hear the road in the distance. It's right next to the field on one side, and on the other side there's a path for people, and thousands of people use it every day. So some birds do come here, and there are some interesting and unusual birds here, but for the most part there are much better places in and around the Bay Area to put an estuary. This was considered an ecological approach and a sustainable approach to the natural landscape and reconstruction of natural landscapes. But the problem is, it's an urban environment, and there was 200 years of urban history here before they turned it back into a tidal wetland. And there are more people here and more cars and more social uses of this space any type of estuary could possibly create. So in the end, this doesn't bear any relationship to actual nature. It's pure simulacrum. Baudrillard talks about simulacrums in his philosophy, and how the map overlays the real until you have nothing left but the map. And that's exactly what happened here. The map determined where this estuary was, the size of the estuary, and it became simply a map of the real, overlaying the real, creating a hyperreal reality while destroying what was actually here. Henry Lefebvre, who is a French philosopher, often talks about space being a palimpsest. Space is a bunch of maps, and some of the maps have been incompletely erased, and so you're putting a map over an existing map. And that's how spaces in modern cities get made. In America, though, oftentimes we don't value our history, so that we don't keep the map, the original map, and we just kind of destroy the existing history that was there. They erased the map of Crissy Field and substituted it for a map of the wetlands that were here in the 1800s. Architecture is really about creating habitable places for people to live. And one of the ways of doing that is to create authentic places with authentic identities and authentic history behind it. And when you start destroying the existing history and creating an ideal history, it creates these spaces that are everywhere but are nowhere. We're here at the Palace of Fine Arts. This is technically right across the highway from Crissy Field. With the Palace of Fine Arts, we see a pond that's man-made and doesn't try to mimic nature. There are actually a lot more birds here than there are at Crissy Swamp. The pond here is authentic and authentically man-made and doesn't try to mimic nature. The relationship with nature here is that nature is something to be revered. Nature is something that helps man to discover their own creativity. The Palace of Fine Arts is an ideal architectural form. It doesn't seek to simulate nature. It seeks to live in harmony with nature. The statement that the Palace of Fine Arts makes is that human creativity comes from nature. Nature with a capital N. And so this environment has a social use. People come here and experience this place in a social way. It's a place for humans and also for nature. It creates a relationship between humans and nature. There isn't a desperate attempt to reclaim an idealized nature, to appropriate an idealized past, to return to some missing natural world that we never really inhabited. It creates a type of utopian nature, nostalgia for a pre-modern world. The Palace of Fine Arts was created in a hopeful time when we thought that we could integrate the modern world, the industrial world, with the creative world, with the natural world, when human beings could live in harmony with nature. This is a very different age than what we're living in.